And we are live. What do we salvage from the fire of American evangelicalism? We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of The Urban Perspective. What's up, world? Pastor Jerome here, and you are tuned into The Urban Perspective. Listen, if this is your first time with us, do me a favor. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, feel free to follow me at Jerome Gay or go to my website for further content and things like that. But listen, I know you've been waiting for this. The wait is finally over. This brother is no stranger to The Urban Perspective. I'm grateful to be joined here by Pastor Brandon Washington. Listen, he's written a book that's hot off the presses. I'm excited for you to meet Pastor Brandon. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the lead pastor of Embassy Christian Bible Church. He grew up in Dallas, Texas, and upon graduating from the University of North Texas, he commenced studies at Denver Seminary, receiving an MA in both systematic theologies, apologetics, and ethics. He and his wife, Cherie, have been married for 18 years and are the proud parents of Reese and Ellis. Pastor Brandon Washington, welcome to The Urban Perspective.
Thank you for having me. You know, I've been looking forward to this for a while. This is the one I was hoping would happen. I'm glad we got here.
Listen, man, we got to talk about this. Let me just put this on the screen. We got to talk about this, a burning house, burning house. What do we salvage from the fire of American evangelicalism? Listen, bam, we got to put this up here. Bam. All of my 30 plus, 40 plus, remember this from In Living Color. Bam. Right. We are so excited, man. First of all, congratulations to you, man. Congratulations. We have been wanting you to write. You have an amazing theological, apologetic mind. And so we're grateful for this book to finally be here, man. Just tell me this, man. How do you feel? How do you feel to be at this point, to be a published author?
You know, this is something you can appreciate. You know how when you have, and a few people warned me about this. I've been working on that book for about 2 years. Between proposal and writing was more than that, almost 3. And a friend of mine told me, prepare yourself for the release date, because if you're not careful, it can seem anticlimactic because you put so much work into it, and then it comes out, and then there's an explosion, and then it fizzles out. But that has not been my experience. I have so many people who reached out to me and let me know. I got 2 responses for the most part. One of them was, I didn't know. And the other was, I'm glad to know it's not just me. That has been a consistent comment I received. Some friends of mine, friends from high school, contacted me, and one even told me he was in the middle of a workout and had to stop because it was such an emotional hit for him, because he realized it wasn't just him who was struggling with the movement in the way that he is.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to my first question. As you know, I've been able to read the book. I was part of the team, and as I'm reading, there's just so many highlights and so many notes and so many poignant points that you provide in the book. So I think it's best to start here. What led you to write this book? You know, what led you to write something like this?
This is also something you can appreciate because you remember what seminary was like, and I had a flaw. I just had this realization maybe a few years ago. I had a skewed understanding of what seminary would be like because I'm from Dallas, and I attended Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, and every seminarian I knew was Black, every one of them. So I was a large church where the pastor is a graduate of Dallas Seminary, and most of the pastoral staff graduated from there or another seminary. So every seminarian I knew was African American, and that gave me a skewed understanding of what the seminary experience would be like. So when I left Dallas and moved to Denver, I realized right away how flawed my sample size was in Dallas, because when I got to Denver Seminary is about half the size of Dallas, and the Black student body was in the dozens. I knew every Black student at Denver Seminary, and we quickly realized we were not having the same experience as our classmates. The discussions were not the same. The theology was the same. We shared orthodoxy. We shared theological notions, theological ideas, but some of the practice of it, the orthopraxy of these ideas, it was not the same. So among the things that came up was the dozens of so students who were in this place of confusion. We realized that we have more expectations of the gospel. We have a wider domain of the gospel, where many of our classmates were thinking the gospel is Jesus died to deliver us from the penalty of our sin and have us stand clean before God, which will allow us to one day have an eternal heavenly reward. We'll have eternal bliss with him. But among us, the question was, what is the contemporary relevance, the temporal world relevance on the life in which we're living right now? What is the relevance of the gospel to this world? And that's why conversations regarding social justice and racial reconciliation and ethnic harmony, things of that sort, came up more often in our conversations than it did for our classmates. And I realized we have two different understandings and correspondingly different expectations of the gospel that we claim to share. And I read a work by Carl F.H. Henry in which he made a similar observation 50, 60 years earlier. He said that any definition of the gospel that is not mindful of social justice is a truncation of the gospel message. And I wanted to have a conversation that addressed how we've truncated the gospel and how we can have a more comprehensive perspective on our gospel message and appreciate its implications on the chasm, the yawning chasm that is widening within the church, the Black and white church in America.
Now, just right quick, because you mentioned a gospel that does not address the social ills or social justice, is a truncated gospel. But now the immediate response from those that want to dismiss this beautiful work is that you're talking about a social gospel.
Yes.
So what is the line of demarcation and delineation of a gospel that addresses social issues versus a social gospel?
Yeah. So I want to be careful that I do not have someone hear me say that worldly solutions to worldly problems is our responsibility. I believe the eternal solution to the worldly problems is our responsibility. And I would argue, and I think I stand firm on this, I'm on good ground here, the same death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. I try to drive that home quite a bit. We often stop at the resurrection, but he is not merely risen. He is risen and he presently reigns as king. The same death, burial, resurrection, and ascension that reconciled us to the Father, it also reconciles us to one another, and it confronts social ills. So whenever someone presses against me trying to bring the gospel to bear on social ills in the world, and they charge me with espousing a social gospel, my response is the gospel is by definition social. It is a social act. It is a reconciling act. It reconciles humanity to God, and it reconciles humanity to humanity. So to argue against the social aspect of the gospel is itself the truncation of the message. It's reducing it to something less than it is.
Awesome. So tell me this, why the title A Burning House? I mean, that's an interesting title to describe American evangelicalism. Why the title?
That title came to mind because, okay, so, and I hope, when you're a writer, you hope these things come forth, but there can be some arrogance in that expectation. I chose that title because I am a fan of James Baldwin's literary style. So among the my favorite works to read was James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And it's an essay. You can read it in a day. It's less than 100 pages. And in that work, he asked, "Do I wish to be integrated into a burning house?"
Hmm.
And then it became relevant to this work because everyone quotes Martin Luther King's 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech. Everyone's mindful of of not attending to color of skin, but content of character. And
Mhm.
everyone fixates on a few key points from that message. I want to say this parenthetically, they disregard the broader indicting tenor of the message. They only choose those 2, 3 quotes and they misappropriate them. They take them out of their context so they can apply them
Yeah.
for some
Yeah, we
part of
we we gonna get there, Doc. Remember, we
okay.
gonna get there, Doc.
Okay. That's a soapbox for me. But that message was in 1963. What's often downplayed is after he preached the "I Have a Dream" speech, he published a work that was focused on the social aspect of the
Mhm.
movement. What are the implications now? How do we have not just a racial or an ethnic harmony, but how do we make injustices right? Long-standing, centuries-old injustices right. That started to dominate the messages he preached in 1964 onward, and he
Mhm.
realized in those years, those latter years of his life, which bore marks. He lost a lot of following. Everyone talks, he's a hero today, but everyone overlooks the fact that in the last three
Mhm.
to four years of his life, he had a very low approval rating in the general populace. And it's because his message was moving much toward making the history right. And he
Right.
said in 1968 in a conversation with Harry Belafonte, and Harry Belafonte records this in his memoir. He says they were in a hotel room and they were about to address an event the following day. And Martin Luther King said to him, I believe we've integrated our people into a burning house."
Mm.
He in an interview in 1967, he conceded that much of the speech he preached in 1963, the "I Have a Dream" speech, he says it was a little misguided. It was a little blind to the circumstances, and the subsequent years taught him that. And so he struggled with, what do you do with the fact that you fought for integration for all these years, and when you moved everyone into the house, they're surrounded by relational arsonists. The house is on fire.
Wow.
And Harry Belafonte actually asked him, now that we've done this, what do we do with this burning house? And Martin Luther King's response to that was, I guess we have to become firemen. I have, for most of my
Mm.
adult life, fought for the integration of American Christianity, the integration of American evangelicalism. But in the last few years, I've come to grips with the realization that I have been inviting people into a burning house. And I believe it's my responsibility to take on the call of a fireman. So I'm not walking away. I intend
Exactly.
to do all I can to redeem, and I have to redeem it from within. But I'm still getting singed. To full disclosure,
Right.
I'm experiencing. It's hard to convince someone of a route toward recovery when they think they're fine. But
Right.
and that to me is an aspect of the house being ablaze. So I incorporated that language that Martin Luther King adopted from James
Yeah.
Baldwin and tried to bring it to the Christian context.
Now that's awesome, and that's a great point, because one of the things I said in my book was, hey, I want to be compelling more than combative.
Yes.
And but there's times and seasons for both.
Yeah.
And you address, some of the sources and issues to us getting to this point, to where essentially we're talking about integration, but we haven't really unpacked the implications of integration that's not authentic integration. It's been assimilation. There's
Yes.
still a hierarchy. And
Right.
one of the things you point out that I thought was brilliant in the introduction, you describe how race is a social construct, and we agree with that, and how at one point even Italians were not considered white.
Yes.
Historically speaking, white was a mark of what one wasn't, more than an identifier of who or what someone is.
Right.
Can you break that down in detail? Because a lot of people are unaware, and his book has tons of sources. You will have the sourcing. This man has done his homework. And so a lot of times people don't know that. People kind of familiar with Irish, but not that how Italians weren't considered white. and how white was a marker of not being black more than something that you are. So break that down for us.
Yeah, so America was founded as um as a descendant. It's a series of colonies that come out of England. And England adopted the Eurocentric mindset,
Mhm.
centralizing self. And so that their cultural norms and their ethnic identity, and I do use those two categories separately, but their cultural norms and their ethnic identity became the standard. It's the reference point. They
Mhm.
recognize self as the top of a human caste system. They recognize the Eurocentric context, cultural norms, as the
Mhm.
top of the human hierarchy. And then everyone else fell beneath them, but they didn't all fall to the same place. And the way race came about is you had to start to categorize these groups of people that were on the North American continent, along with the Euro minded, the culturally Eurocentric people groups. And so they would rank them in various shades along the way. And the extreme other would be the Black Africans who first landed on the
Mhm.
shores in
Mhm.
1619. But and this is often overlooked, but they were not the only ones lower in the caste system, lower in the rankings. Irish were lower, the Italians were lower, Jews were not considered white, and they were. It's not just they were a simply a lesser white. Many of them were not considered white at all. And in that scenario, it's not whiteness is not a racial identity, because whiteness was the standard. Non-whiteness, and in the case of an African, an enslaved African, blackness was the racial identity. There was a racial reference point. It was the racial measure. You were not
Mhm.
evaluated according to what you were. You were evaluated according to what you were not. And the one of the reasons that is a troubling term today is the word is in it's not static. It's in constant motion. So Italians became white at the turn of the 20th century. It was a deliberate and strategic act because they were suffering racial persecution, not to the same degree, but they were suffering racial persecution in southern states, and there was a mass lynching of Italian citizens in New Orleans that made the Italian community appeal for racial protection against racial crimes. And the
Mhm.
strategic plan was to identify, gradually, progressively identify as white. Now, that was not a new thing. You'll notice that a lot of Jewish names changed when they became American citizens. It was an attempt
Right.
to be invisible in plain sight, to
Yeah.
assimilate
Mhm.
and integrate into a cultural norm in plain sight. A lot of European names, Polish names, they changed, and they would actually drop their accents to avoid being recognized as Irish or Scottish. But Black people can't do that. You have this all-encompassing birthmark that makes hiding in plain sight
Right.
impossible.
Yeah.
It was the thing that made Black people the most viable option when it came to enslavement, because if you're Black, you cannot run away to another place and blend in somewhere else. You will always be recognized as a Black person, and therefore a person qualified and identified as worthy of being enslaved. But that all of those aspects played into how the term and the definitions of the word race as we use that language today, it all played into how we define those terms. It's a relatively new concept. It's only about 300 or 400 years old, and it's a direct result of the colonial actions that occurred in North America. In Africa, Africans were not distinguishing amongst themselves using terms of race, but they did make distinctions, tribal distinctions. They did have these tribal and cultural distinctions among themselves. One of the mistakes Americans, Westerners, tend to make is they look at Africa and they see one race of people. They see one mass, one group of people. But Africa is actually the second largest continent on the planet, and it's the most diverse continent on the planet. Just because everyone looks the same ethnically does not mean they are
Right.
one culturally. But what the North Americans did is they looked at all of them, made them one, and qualified all of them to be the bottom of the social caste system by inventing a thing that we call race, and Black people were the base of that structure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because there was so much pseudoscience, pseudosociology, a hierarchical anthropology, things like the degenerative hypothesis, the teleological argument
Yeah,
were all deployed, and when they were deployed, it always put Black and brown people at the bottom.
at the bottom.
And so, when you make that distinction of white being a mark of which you weren't, there was a very intense effort to distance yourself from any form of Blackness in order to achieve some form of acceptance or things like that. So I'm grateful that you made that distinction because, we obviously, we're not exactly where we were. We've made tons of progress, but people still operate from those mindsets. Sadly, even within the church, one of the things you mentioned when we talk about this, because you're saying, hey, you're in this burning house, but you're going to be a fireman. You're not leaving evangelicalism. You still feel it's a fight worth fighting, and I do as well, because we're called to the church. It's his bride. We don't get to divorce it, even if some of our siblings don't see or value us properly. But you talk about in the book a seminary experience. You said a seminary professor told you to avoid diversity because you'd be better served just reaching Black people.
Right.
Has this been a common experience, and why do you think this view or tactic is so prevalent within the church, especially in light of some of the history you share within the book on race being a social construct, really a distance from Blackness? But even now, it's like, hey, they say we're a kingdom operating, but then you're encouraged to be homogenous and
So
to intentionally segregate in some cases.
yeah, I think he was making two grave errors, not just one. The first was that was indicative of his understanding of the gospel,
Mm,
because his agenda was his agenda was twofold. One of them temporal, and the other eternal. The temporal one was get as many people into the church as possible so they can hear the gospel. Get as many people in, and in his mind, appealing only to the people who look like me was the most strategic way of getting as many people into the church as possible. I didn't say this
mhm,
parenthetically. Embassy Christian Bible Church is about 40%. We've experienced a significant change because we merged with another church in our city, but the church is about 40 to 45% white and 50% Black, and then the balance is Latino and Asian. We look like a church that he told me would fail. And
mm,
I think the reason I mention that is, in fact, I make it a point to take every church anniversary. I make it a point to take a photo of the room so I can show him, because he told us we would close our doors within 5 years. I take a photo of the room every year since the 5th anniversary, and I email it to him. And the only caption I have is, "We're still here." And I want to show him the room that he told me would never exist. So
wow.
so so he had now in his defense, he thought he was doing me a favor, because he thought you get as many people into the room as possible and you preach the gospel to them, which brings me to his second issue. He has a truncated gospel, because he said, "Don't worry about getting everyone together now. We'll be together when we're in heaven." And
Mhm.
I'm having to walk him through this reality. What we're doing right now is not practice. This is not a dressed rehearsal. This is the real thing. We join a mass of believers who have preceded us, who are presently in the presence of the risen King,
Mhm.
shouting his praises at the top of their lungs. When we gather for corporate worship, we are gathering with the community of believers, living and dead, who are shouting
Right.
the praises of our King. If the Bible says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth
On
as it is
earth.
in heaven," why would we wait until then to advocate, to pursue what the gospel affords us now? That is a misrepresentation of what Christ has accomplished on our behalf. Now, he's a missiologist, and he was bringing his missiology to that conversation with me. But I'm saying he has a poor, in the midst of all of his studies as a missiologist, he has a poor understanding of the gospel. He has truncated it to the point of lauding a separation within us as a means of counting how many can be in attendance. He was more focused on how many could be present than he was on what kind of people will the church be. If I preach a truncated gospel, I am discipling, I'm making a kind of people that I believe is inconsistent with our kingdom citizenship.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And that is so prevalent because homogeneity is easier.
Easier.
It's easier when you pretty much have the same culture, likes and dislikes. There's differences and there's nuance, but that's the point. We don't get to experience the fullness of that. And I get certain areas may be highly populated with one race or one ethnicity.
Right.
But when we say that we're going to intentionally exclude or not even target as a missiological strategy is just unbiblical. And as you said, it is a truncated gospel. Another thing you alluded to it earlier, but I want you to unleash now, because you talk about how Dr. Martin Luther King had regrets after his speech. Not about unity. He wasn't against unity or his children being judged by the content of their character versus the color of their skin, but how his words were misunderstood.
Yes.
Have you seen a similar pattern within evangelicalism as it relates to diversity? So 2 parts. I want you to historically kind of break down Dr. King, because so many of us miss that aspect. We hear I Have a Dream, and that's pretty much all that's promoted.
Mm-hmm.
Hear about the economic and social empowerment he talked about property and land that he talked about. That part, the radical parts of him, are often left out. So I want you to kind of speak to that. But then, do you see a similar pattern still remaining within evangelicalism, and why do you think that is, if that's the case?
Okay, I think I'm going to foreshadow one of the questions you have coming. I see it coming. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I am not a critical race theorist. Okay. But I have been repeatedly accused of critical race theory. In fact, you and I are both contributors to a book, Urban Apologetics, that just came out yesterday. And Dr. Mason commissioned me to write a chapter on critical race theory. And one of what I addressed there is that I believe that we're accused of critical race theory because the Black church and African American historiography resembles that of CRT. And it's because CRT co-opted it, adapted it from the Black church. And one thing I'm trying to underline here is Martin Luther King was a very good historian. And one of the implications of that is you have to concede that the present moment is the final chapter in a series of historical events. He's arguing for that repeatedly. It's the culmination of a series of historical events. That's true of every moment. You did not simply jump from a point in the past and leapfrog over points in history to this moment. A series of events culminate in where you are. So one of the things he was trying to drive home, even in the I Have a Dream speech, that gets overlooked because only still 2-3 lines from it, he was trying to show how how systemically there were a group of people who were cared for, deliberately invested in, and there were those who were deliberately deprived. And my favorite example of that, because it's so easily pointed out, is there's a wealth gap in America that exists in 2023 that did not come as a result of something that happened in June of 2023. In the middle of the 20th century, redlining was used as a weapon to keep people of color out of certain neighborhoods. It gave rise to what we call suburbs today. After the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, I was just talking to my wife about this morning because we were driving through a neighborhood here in Denver that is overrun with private schools. All those private schools, they cropped up in the middle of the 20th century because after segregation was outlawed, the solution was start private schools where you can make your own rules and accept the students of your choosing, and you can run away from integrated public schools. So segregation resulted in the breakdown in both education and in housing. So what does that result in today? The public schools in those same communities were underfunded because the people who had means left, and funding to a school is determined by tax and the tax payment of those who are there. So you've made the public schools low income schools. And by creating this segregation within housing, you allow people to purchase homes that will accrue wealth in the suburbs, while you relegated another group of people to the urban center, and you categorize their property as low value, as a low income community. That results in people being able to buy houses that they can either pass on to their children, or they can sell and pass the proceeds on to their children. That results in generational wealth, and that has culminated in the wealth gap that we have today. Martin Luther King pointed out how the federal government was subsidizing white farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And black farmers did not qualify for those subsidies. And then they would turn to you and say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But those who were saying that received the benefits of finances provided by the state. They were benefiting, they were among the privileged, while turning to everyone else and saying, you should be able to do what we've done. But the fact is, those to whom you are saying that were not able to accomplish it with the same access that you had. And they did not experience the same accrued wealth that you accrued. Martin Luther King recognized that integration is only phase one of the process. And he's preaching that for much of the 50s and 60s. But after 1963, he says, now you got to make the history right by addressing it in the present. And that gets overlooked because everyone tries to emphasize they try to misappropriate his statement regarding the color of your skin, the content of your character versus the color of your skin, and use that to argue that he was colorblind. But if you read that came after that, that is not an appropriate reading of his message.
We're gonna open it up, but I gotta throw in MJ's, because I know how you feel about Thomas Sowell. So I just got to throw this in here now, and we're gonna open up for Q&A at the end, guys. But he said Thomas Sowell would argue that the wealth gap you're speaking of is natural because he has studied disparities in other civilizations. How would you respond to that?
The existence of a natural occurrence in another place does not give credence, does not allow you to assume it is natural in every place. You have to make sure you.
So that's like an anachronistic anthropology.
There you go. You have to go. He's trying to universalize an observation somewhere. He's trying to employ it here. But you have to read every one of these scenarios as an independent occurrence to be sure that the circumstances that unfolded did not result in the moment that you are in now. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, I would argue that Thomas Sowell, and I'm not the biggest of fans since we're here, but I would argue that Thomas Sowell comes to his reading of those other societies with his conclusion already in place. So he is projecting onto those society. It's confirmation bias. He's projecting onto them the conclusion as he's assessing the circumstances. But even if that's not true, let's give him the benefit of the doubt here. Even if that's not true, he is an outlier among sociologists and economists who recognize that basically what has happened in America is one of the teams had an unfair advantage in a baseball game for 7 innings. And that was corrected at the bottom of the 7th. But the standard of victory did not change. You still have to have the higher score. So if one team has been cheating for 7 innings, you cannot then say at the bottom of the 7th, we're not going to cheat anymore, and say now everything is fair, because saying that at the bottom of the 7th inning does not erase the sordid history, the unholy score that culminated over several centuries, and you're going to still hold the losing team to a standard that they cannot meet because they did not have the same advantages of the cheating team.
So you brought this up, so let's just go there because you addressed this in more detail in your book. So let's deal with the buzzword that has lost a little steam because woke gets all of the vitriol now. But tell me about CRT and how people have responded to your book. So go ahead and give us a working definition, because so many people that accuse people like me, Dr. Mason, yourself, anyone who speaks about race, even if we're saying we're still for unity and that we're not saying that all white people are evil or they need to repent for being white. We're not saying that, but they conflate unredeemed wokeness with anyone who is a Christian and speaks about race. So give us a definition of critical race theory. Then how have people responded to this book so far? I know it hasn't been out that long, but give us that, because woke is the buzzword now. So anything you say, you're just thrown into the woke crowd.
Yeah.
Break that down for us.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. That question has a lot of meat on it. So a couple of things. Number one of my goals, and I have to choose when I'm going to get around to doing this. One of my goals is to redeem the word woke, because here's what has happened: the word woke has been co-opted and inappropriately redefined as a means of making a mockery of anything that it deliberately equips us to study the past and evaluate how our past culminated in the present racial chasm, the yawning chasm we have. So we have to redeem the word woke. The word woke merely recognized the call or the condition of being aware. And so we've made a mockery of that word. And I would argue that while it is a 20th century colloquial term, I would point out that Paul charged the church at Ephesus with being awake in how they read the circumstances and evaluate what's going on. So I would argue not only is woke not a bad term, but it is a biblical imperative for us as believers. Regarding CRT is often victim of the same problem. In fact, I would argue that regarding CRT, it's even worse. I have yet to meet a person who accuses me of being a critical race theorist. I've yet to meet one who can effectively define what they mean by CRT. CRT is merely a movement that was birthed in the middle of the 20th century during the midpoint of the civil rights movement, and it was and its agenda, the agenda of the founders, was to ask, why is it that so much progress is made on paper in the civil rights movement, but experientially, we don't see it. And the thing that prompted that in the mind of Derek Bell is the Brown versus Board of Education decision. How is it that Brown versus Board outlaws segregation, but a decade after Brown versus Board, schools are less, not more, integrated? They're even more segregated a decade later. How did that happen? And his argument was it could not occur accidentally. It must be a matter of widespread social values and systemic conditions that uphold those social values. So when something is outlawed, it is merely replaced by new policies that uphold the values that have been outlawed. Like I said earlier, you integrate public schools. How do you avoid living an integrated life? You launch private schools. So while you've outlawed made one thing a crime, you have not addressed the values issue. And I can merely move over here to start my own private schools. Derek Bell is pointing out how the circumstances, the systems in place lent themselves to those types of decisions being made. Now, here's what's wrong with how we're using CRT today. Anything that is any historiography that reads the systemically racist past of America and considers its present implications is automatically written off as CRT. And here's how we do that effectively. You treat CRT as Marxism, because Marxism also applies a model of evaluating institutions. You can write CRT off as Marxism, and then you can write anyone who does something similar to what CRT does. You write them off as a Marxist, and you can stop there. You can be dismissive because that's written off as a Marxist thing to do, to recognize systemic brokenness. But I got to tell you that one of the problems with that is oftentimes the assumption is that critical race theory, they're conceiving of, they're speculating regarding systemic brokenness. But mid-20th century critical race theorists were not speculating. They had Plessy v. Ferguson. They had Separate but Equal. They had the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1770s and 1850. They had the legislation that gave rise to redlining and omission from secured home loans. They could point out actual policy as evidence, and not just at the local level, but at the federal level. They could put on actual policies. So they weren't speculating, they were observing. They're not creating a situation of systemic brokenness because they feel it. They're responding to the observed systemic brokenness.
Exactly.
And they're bringing an academic assessment to that. Did they always get it right? I would argue no. I think that's it. Critical race theory does a very good job of deconstructing. But at some point, you have to stop deconstructing and start rebuilding. You have to get to a point of redeeming. It's the reason redeem is the first word in the subtitle of A Burning House. I think you have to stop deconstruction and start the rebuilding process. They don't have a gospel that lends itself to that. They don't have an eschatology, a hope for the future that lends itself to that because they're functionally atheistic. But their understanding of historiography and their read of the American past and its implications on the present, that has merit. And it's irresponsible for us as believers to dismiss them out of hand when we have a gospel that we can bring to the brokenness that they are observing.
Wow. Now, thank you for that, because so many people throw out that word, that phrase so loosely without a definition. And it's essentially a way to just dismiss people. And oftentimes they're deploying the genetic fallacy.
Yes.
And that's often deployed without so they can not give any credence to what we're saying, even though what we're saying is rooted in scripture, rooted in the Bible. And we don't affirm everything even the unredeemed woke crowd is saying just because they're Black. We're saying those scripture is leading us, but they're just easily dismissing. And what you do with your book is you give that balance to say we do need to combat these things, but we need to combat this from within. And not go to these outside sources as the foundation, but still keeping the gospel as the foundation. Well, so I got to ask this though, with all what you said, a professor telling you to pursue Black people, not always feeling at home or welcome, having a different seminary experience than your white counterparts. With all of that going on, why do you stay?
I believe that the problem with evangelicalism is not its theology, it's the application. I believe that evangelicalism has good theology that has been abandoned. It's one of the reasons I dedicated a chapter to men and women who I would contend did this well. And I want to be careful that no one hears this as a dismissive assessment of evangelicalism. It's a lament of how the word evangelicalism has been misappropriated. I would argue that what we're dealing with in America is not evangelicalism at all. It's fundamentalism cloaked behind the term evangelicalism. And the solution to that would be to adopt a much more comprehensive understanding of the gospel and go about carefully integrating the body of believers, and not just local or even national integration, but a global integration where American evangelicalism moves out of its isolated, its cloistered bubble and exists alongside and at the feet of global evangelicalism, because in many respects, the global evangelicalism gets this right consistently. My favorite example of that is in America, because we're westernized, we have a fixation on individualism and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And I got this on my own. But if you go to the global South, where evangelicalism is thriving, while it's dying in the West, it is thriving in the global South. And when you go there, you recognize that on the whole, those are communal societies. So an injury to Pastor Jerome is an injury to me. And coming to Pastor Jerome's aid is not just for Pastor Jerome, it's for me. It's for the whole community. They look at the community the same way we would look at a human body. An injury to one part of your body is not merely the problem of that one part. My hand's injury is an issue for my whole body. And so the community comes to the aid of the individual. Now that's relevant because that shapes social ethics. That's an inevitable product of that type of evangelicalism is mindful of social justice. And injustice committed against anyone is an assault against the community. So the community comes to the aid of the individual, not just for the individual, but for the health, the well-being of the whole community. Vernon Grounds drove that home. He says, to be a part of the body means I advocate for my brother, which means taking a stand whenever injustice is committed against him or her. It's an aspect of who we are. And I would argue that it is a marker of good biblical global evangelicalism. Activism is a fundamental quality of good biblical evangelicalism. So whenever someone says to me, Brandon, stop preaching that social justice stuff, just preach the gospel, my response to them is, you and I have different gospels. Because if I preach a comprehensive gospel, I must be mindful of that social justice stuff. And it's essential to my identity as an evangelical, because I'm not just called to the cross and the Bible and conversions. I'm called to activism. This is Bedmington's quadrilateral. I'm called to activism as a marker of who I am as a believer and a citizen in his kingdom.
Awesome. So last question, and we'll see if we have some questions from our virtual audience. Why should we get this book? Why should we get this book right here? And tell us your goal. What's your hope that people walk away with?
I'll answer the second question first. My goal is to redeem evangelicalism as a movement. I think that much of the injury to evangelicalism is self-inflicted because we've abandoned much of our identity. So I'm not calling us to a new thing. I'm calling us back to the old thing. And I'm asking the body of believers to return to the love we had at first, to the movement that we were in at our inception. Why get the book? Because it's not merely, and you've mentioned this a few times, and I appreciate you doing that. It's not merely me berating the movement; it's me addressing it from the perspective of hope. And so I don't just say, "Here's what's wrong with it." I try to provide some solutions that are present throughout, but they're collected in the final chapter. So the idea of integrating as a global evangelical movement and theological recollection, just the retrieving, theological retrieving, going back to the values of who we were early on and recognizing places where the movement is thriving in the global South and incorporating many of those values into who we are. Being careful in how we discuss the Trinity. We often think of the Trinity as three individuals. We do this unwittingly, but three individuals, all of whom are divine and all of whom have coexisted, and the three of them make up God. But from people, and I get much of this from Pastor Jerome Gay, but from theologians like Tertullian, I learned that the Trinity is a community. It's a triunity of three. And the social harmony that makes up our Trinity should be indicative. It should be on display of human communities. We should seek to look like the harmonious triune Trinity, our God. We don't just bow before God, replicate God, emulate God, look like God in the world. So it's not just a matter of here's what's wrong with it. The hope is that we can move toward redeeming who we are. I want to say this one last thing, and then I'm gonna hear from you. And now I need to sing your praises for a second. But I also, one of my goals when I wrote this, I wrote to two groups of people. One of them would be people who think there's nothing wrong with evangelicalism as it is. So I wanted to try to paint a picture that shows some of our brokenness so we can make way toward recovery. You cannot experience healing. You cannot experience redemption unless you first recognize there's a problem and potentially a need for repentance on your way to the redemption. And there are some who would disagree with me and think it's fine as it is. I want to show them some areas where it's broken. But then there's others who, in response to the brokenness, have left. I'd never heard the word ex-evangelicals until I started writing this book. And they became the other audience in mind as I was writing out the chapters. I want to minister to them, and among the things I want to do is conceive the observations they're making. I want them to know they're not crazy. I want them to know they're not. This is not an illusion. What they're seeing is real. But I also wanted to give them hope, to show them how what you're noticing is not a problem with the movement as it is. It's a problem with the practitioners who are misappropriating the language and living it out poorly. Instead of giving it over to them, let's redeem it. Now, I need to say this carefully because I know your agenda here, and I know why I'm here. Okay. The person I've seen do this well is Jerome Gay. I read The Whitewashing of Christianity, and the thing I noticed, even in areas of that book where you could have flexed and expressed your discontent, your righteous indignation, you approached it as a pastor. Your agenda was not to bash people over the head with wrongs, but to call them to repentance, so we together as a community can recover from those wrongs. It left an impression on me. It caused me to press pause. There were days, Pastor, when I had to stop writing and walk away from it, sometimes for weeks at a time. I was driving my editor crazy because I kept pushing the due date. I had to walk away from it because it led to some very tense emotional moments for me. And one of the encouragements I had was, in the midst of that, your book came out. The Whitewashing of Christianity came out. And I contacted you. I called you and I said, you wrote this from the perspective of a pastor. And the deliberate subtitle, what was the subtitle of that?
A hidden past, a hurtful present, and a hopeful future.
The subtitle blessed me before I read the first page. You were not merely saying, here's the problem. You said, here's a problem, and here's what we can do about it. And that caused me to pause and recover and try to get to a place of balance. So this book, I'm hoping, will lend itself to ironic dialogue, a communal dialogue, and not a heated, pointless yelling match back and forth. These are the observations of people of color, and here's how I think we can recover from the circumstances.
Amen. Well, family, listen, A Burning House. Get this book, add this to your library. Pastor Brandon Washington, a wonderful theologian, awesome man, awesome husband, awesome father, and he lives out his theology. He has the mix of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, and also orthopathy, the right emotion as well about this. So get his book. Be sure to follow him. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. I want to open it up. Let's just want you to see some of the love that people are showing you here. It talks about right here, my girl Michelle, to enhance your knowledge. She threw some books out there: Whitewashing, Church Hurt, of course, A Burning House, Urban Apologetics 1 and 2. She said, A Burning House is in my top 3 favorite books. I have read Church Hurt and A Burning House twice.
Oh my!
So that's awesome, man. So much love. Thank you, sis. Thank you, sis. And she's helped us get the word out. Her and Shani, listening, love those sisters. She said, anytime I hear someone say that, I wonder if they ever read the entire Bible. She was talking about what you talked about earlier. And then she's showing some more love for whitewashing. So thanks for what you said about that. But guys, I want to open up any questions. Be sure to like, share. Please subscribe to the Urban Perspective. Be sure to give Pastor Brandon Washington a follow. Give him a follow there, B_Wash75 on Instagram. If you're looking for content, go to my website, jeromegayjr.com, and go to youtube.com/The Urban Perspective to subscribe. But man, thank you, man. Thank you for this work. As I'm reading this and I'm looking in the back, because we always gotta go to back and look at that bibliography.
Yeah.
The brother did his work. He put in his work, man. He put in his work. But we got a question here, man. Got a question. What other projects do you have coming up? It's funny. We were talking about that offline.
Yeah. So I gotta tell you, I'm going to do this because I'm pretty proud of this work. So, of course, a burning house, but you and I both contributed to this.
Yes, yes.
And this just came out yet. Where am I going? This just came
Yeah.
out yesterday, and I have never been prouder. Usually, when you write, you want your focus is on solo works. That's often an emphasis. It is at least I'll speak out of my flesh. That's a reality for me. I am as if not more proud of this. And this is volume 2. This and volume 1. I believe this is a tour de force. I got to tell you that if I had this in the 90s when I became a believer, it would have I would have avoided so many pitfalls, so many complications.
Mhm.
It's and so much of the just emotional questioning, the self-worth questioning, because all of the Christianity I was exposed to growing up in Texas and listening to Christian talk radio, none of it was mindful of my heartache and the context in which I was applying the faith. I wish I'd had collections of works like this that speak into the world where I lived. So I'm very proud of Urban Apologetics, volumes 1 and 2, and I would say that everyone should have their hands on that. And frankly, I wrote the chapter, my contribution to that book, at the same time that I wrote A Burning House. So much of the backstory that is in the chapter I wrote for Urban Apologetics is unpacked more in A Burning House because of space restrictions, because it's a shared work. Space restrictions in Urban Apologetics,
Yeah,
I had to do
yeah.
much of that work in a larger book. You did something similar to that with the whitewashing. I noticed that too in volume 1.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had to shorten it, and that was just like a precursor because I was writing the whitewashing Christianity when Dr. Mason asked me to contribute.
Yeah.
So I just said, "Hey, here you go." It was it was good, and then I was glad that it just had a buzz for somewhat for whitewashing. So you got another question from my girl Shawnee. What advice do you have for the young seminarian in your situation?
Okay, so that's a good point. So after I just some of my backstory. I started seminary. I'm about to tell my age here. I started seminary in the spring of 2004. And because my experience in Dallas was a misrepresentation of what a seminary population is, I hated seminary, despised it. And in fact, I was dealing with comments from classmates that I was amazed that someone would feel so free to say some of the things either to me or in front of me while I was in seminary. And my solution to that was to leave, and I had no intentions. I had no plans on coming back. And then a mentor of mine named Dr. Felix Gilbert, who has on to be with the Lord since then, he insisted that I come back and complete the process. And Dr. Gilbert I don't know if this is because he was in the military or because it's a Caribbean cultural thing, but he didn't understand when I would tell him no. So despite the fact that I repeatedly said no, he insisted that I come back and finish. He says, I've made the same observations at the school. I'll fix it from the top, because he was the director of Denver Seminary's urban initiative. And he says, you fix it from the bottom at the student level. And he introduced me to Dr. Young, the president and the dean and provost at the time, who's named Dr. Randy McFarland. And they assured me that they were aware of these concerns and they wanted my help in making some progress. And that, frankly, that culminated in me being on the board after I graduated. And one of the first things Dr. Gilbert did in his role as the director of the Urban Initiative is he started a Black student fellowship. He started a Black student fellowship. In fact, when I came back and I'd submitted all of my applications, he was there when I turned my application in. He met me as I was coming out of the office, submitting all that work for readmission, and he shook my hand and said, "Congratulations on being the inaugural president of Denver Seminary's Black Student Fellowship." And that's how I found out that I was even a candidate for that role. One of the benefits, one of the goals of that group is to get together on a regular basis. I think we got together at least once a month, and we would hear one another's heartache. We would speak into those things, And it made, though we were only 33 students in a school of over 1,000, though we were such a small group, it kept us from being lonely. It goes back to that whole thing of it's not just me, and it also allowed everyone to to express their heartache without having to start at zero, because other people in the room understood where you were coming from without you having to go into the details of peculiar comments. I remember the day I came to class, I came to that meeting and told the story of a classmate of mine, a church history class, where a classmate of mine argued that it was better to maintain the enslavement of Black Africans, because if you set them free, you would have weakened the nation and America would have lost the Revolutionary War. And his last statement was, it was better for Black Africans to be enslaved than for white Americans to be enslaved, because it would have undermined, it would have weakened us in the midst of that war with Great Britain. And when you go to the Black Student Fellowship and you have conversations around that, and you realize, I'm not crazy. That observation, that was a horrible thing to say out loud, and other people are there to pour into you. So being in community with one another is the solution to getting through that process.
Yeah, for another one. What measures do you have in place to prevent the fire consuming in your church?
We deliberately, this was a foundational value of ours. We're not accidentally diverse. We're not accidentally integrated. It was a non-negotiable value that was a part of who we were from day one, non-negotiable, and it affects how we do everything. So the leadership team, the leadership team reflects who the church is. Even the way some things that get overlooked, some things are often treated as mundane. Even something like worship is essential to how we do that. So we have a deliberately integrated approach to how we do worship. And we don't say it's diverse in that some Sundays are gospel Sunday and some Sundays are contemporary Christian Sunday. Nope, they coexist on the same day in the same worship gathering, and you're sitting next to one another. And we also emphasize the language we use in our church is missional communities. We emphasize that, and we try our best to keep them from being affinity groups. So you end up in a group of people in your home who come from diverse generations, diverse socioeconomic and experiential backgrounds, and there are even different seasons of life and marriage and parenting. And that group of people rub against one another, and ideally, iron sharpens iron. I will warn you that the relationships can be messy, but messiness is merely the route to wholeness, and that's how we try to do it at the local level.
So let this be the last one, man. What are some I think she meant practical things pastors and laymen can do to get involved in putting out the fire? So how can we help? How can we push this, man? Putting out the fire in terms of things that may be happening, but I'm gonna go ahead and take it a step further too in putting this out. So I'm adding to her question.
So a couple answers to that. Number one, become very good historians. I've noticed that in America, we treat history as a thing you have to do to pass an exam, and we are familiar with this event that occurred on this day and in this place. But history is not. That's not history. That's a timeline. History is knowing the relevance of this event on this day and in this place, and knowing what what came from it and what preceded it. Become familiar with the story, and I have to be careful here. The whole story, the whole story. So getting one perspective on our history, which is the general historiography that we adopt in the West, especially in America. Choosing the dominant culture's story is a disservice to the story. It makes sense to me that you will not see systemic oppression when all you're talking about is the bravery of founding fathers and how they fought to resist the oppression of a European king so that we can have independence. But today is June 20th. Yesterday we celebrated Juneteenth. I don't know how y'all do it in your city, but Denver behaves almost as though we are in Texas. I mean, it's a massive celebration, parades everywhere. And Juneteenth is much more indicative of the day when freedom was a value than July 4th. You cannot celebrate independence you cannot celebrate independence while enslaving people. And we tell a story that is not mindful of that reality. While that's the reason Frederick Douglass had to deliver a message. What to the slave is the 4th of July. You're celebrating your independence. And while I'm here speaking to you to celebrate the independence, I'm a fugitive from slavery. This is Frederick Douglass speaking to them. While he's preaching a message, he was guilty of delivering himself from a Maryland enslaver. And he says, I'm saying to you that you have to tell Frederick Douglass's story if you're going to tell Thomas Jefferson's story, because the two of them combined make up our good story. You have to become good historians. The other thing is become good theologians. And one area that needs to be addressed is how we understand the gospel. The book that first convicted me on that was by Scott McKnight, The King Jesus Gospel. We don't preach kingdom gospel. We preach Savior salvation. We preach that Jesus died as a lamb to deliver me from my sin. And we forget the fact that he resurrected and took his seat to reign.
Mm-hmm.
And because we ignore the latter part of that, we believe that he died so that we can be the fullness of who we are, and we can get to go to heaven one day and have golden streets and pearly gates. But no, as king, he has established a culture, and we are citizens in his kingdom. Paul calls us ambassadors in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So it's our responsibility to proliferate that kingdom in a fallen world, and you can do that only by preaching a whole gospel message, the comprehensive gospel. Jesus was mindful of our eternal destiny. I do not want to be accused of denying that, but he was also mindful of our temporal experiences. And it's irresponsible to tell people who are going through hell on earth to wait, because one day he'll be back. He equipped us to bring his message to bear on the brokenness, the hell that they are enduring right now.
Amen. Amen. Pastor Brandon Washington, thank you so much. Family, listen, A Burning House. It is out now, available where books are sold, the hardcover as well as the Kindle. Go out and get this book. Be sure to support Pastor Brandon Washington and this movement. Thank you for tuning in. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. We need you to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me at Jerome Gay. Go to my website for more resources. Make sure you follow Pastor Brandon Washington. Trust me, it's a follow that you will not regret. You can see this man exudes history. He is a walking history book. All of this off the top of his head. If he could rap, he would be one of the best freestylers in the game. All right. So, but he's a historical freestyler, apologetic freestyler, right? So be sure to support this brother. But thank you so much. You've been tuned into the Urban Perspective. We thank you for tuning in. I love you. God bless you. Peace.